Welcome, everyone. This is season 2 of Global Voices, where we talk about what's going on in the world of open finance. Um, I've got today with me Don Cardinal and Ralph Bragg, and we're going to be spending some time talking about interoperability in open finance across the various standards that these gentlemen are involved in. Um, Maybe if we start with some quick introductions and then we can get to a set of questions. So, Don, if you'd like to go first, and then Ralph.
Sure. Hi, I'm Don Cardinal. I'm the Managing Director of Financial Data Exchange. We're the leading data standard for open finance in North America. Ralph?
Hi, my name is Ralph Bragg. I'm the CTO and co-founder of a company called Raidiam. We've been delivering data sharing ecosystems in the Asia Pacific region, Latin America, and the UK with open banking.
And I'm Freddi Gyara. I'm CTO and co-founder of Ozone API. We provide open finance software that enables banks and financial institutions around the world to meet their open finance obligations and beyond that in the world of open APIs. So interoperability, it's such a buzzword. And as the footprint of open finance is kind of growing across the world, this is something that keeps coming up in conversations that we have with regulators and others. So why do we believe interoperability is so important in open finance? Or do we believe, to start with, that it's important in the world of open finance? Ralph, you want to make a start and then
It's not a problem. I'll try and keep this to 60 seconds, and I'll bring the question up to a little bit of a higher question. Why do we believe interoperability in technology is important, full stop, regardless of it being open finance or anything else? And the reason for it is that if you have interoperability of standards, they facilitate communication. And if they facilitate and break down barriers and borders for communication, then you can start conversing to start creating new products and new propositions. The interoperability angle was a real focus of the internet in the early 90s to try and address some of the challenges we had with things like the browser wars. So for those that remember, this website works on Internet Explorer or works best with Netscape Communicator. We don't have those problems anymore, and we don't have to select which browser we want to use in order to use this thing called the internet. And that's because standards, but interoperable standards proven by conformance and certification tests make this all work. And on top of that, everything that we use in modern digital services all sit, including this very podcast. So yes, interoperability is absolutely critical for anything that involves more than two parties that are trying to build, some sort of ecosystem to try and communicate anything. And open finance is no different.
I guess we are all still familiar with the pain of trying to get onto one of these sort of calls using Meet or Zoom or Teams or another flavor of video conferencing, right, where the interoperability doesn't exist, and the pain is still there and evident of what happens when standards don't exist to be able to operate between things that are so ubiquitously used in different places. Don?
But given that, consider that your microphone and your webcam all plugged in with USB. It just plugged in and it works. It reduces barriers to entry and allows competition because, again, no one's competing on the connector end of the device. They're connecting on the keyboard or the camera features. And it gives everyone an equal playing field. It doesn't matter your market cap. If you conform to the standard, if your device is FIDO biometric compliant or FDX compliant, then it's the same as anyone else with $1 trillion of market cap. It's the ultimate democratization, and the consumer wins. Imagine a set of Legos. I just cleaned down the garage and found my kids' old Legos. Imagine if they didn't interop, they didn't interconnect. You would have a bunch of random blocks, and that's okay, but you can't do anything really cool. But once they interconnect, and they're reliably interconnecting, now you have an entire Lego store full of really creative stuff. And I think that's the whole point of this is, again, facilitating communication, but also doing so at internet scale and doing so incredibly cheaply. The costs are trivial. in between each connection. There's nothing unique or different. And that only achieved when you have common standards, but to your point, also certification that, yes, attestation that those standards have been met, and you shouldn't have any issues. It should just plug in and work.
Yeah, and again, I think in the past, the PC wars and IBM's XT and AT standards, and the way the buses that got standardized, and this pretty old school, right? That led very heavily to their ability to kind of percolate into the home computer market in the late 70s and the early 80s. And a lot of that was down to the ability to buy a hard disk from there and buy memory chips from there and a CD-ROM driver from this other place, and it will all work together. No questions asked. So whilst it's kind of easy to give examples of interoperability in the hardware space and the space where things are kind of easy to see and touch and feel, let's kind of pull one veneer of what do you actually see as the bits of a standard like FDX or FAPI that need to be interoperable. We can't go ahead and say like we just need one standard to rule them all. That's not going to happen. So we need to kind of be able to break down that if these elements of these standards kind of work with each other, we're going to get quite far down that path of interoperability. So maybe Don, if you start with that this time.
Yeah, so you really have to think about it as a protocol stack. And I don't know how techy your audience necessarily is, but even when you're having your interconnected to your browser, it depends that DNS existed first, so you knew which website to even connect to. It resolved to an IP address. And so there's this whole stack of technologies that have to work for the experience for the consumer to work. So when you look at open finance, certainly data is important. And if you think about the back of a lorry, a truck, you have a container. Great. Now we've defined what size the container is, and that's wonderful. Those are all JSON objects connecting to a REST database. Great. But you still have to transport the dang thing. So what has that done? So a secure transportation protocol, what side of the road we're driving on, how wide's the lane, how fast can I go, all that good stuff is defined in something like a FAPI, which is basically super OAuth 2, if you will. It's not a net new thing. It doesn't compete with data standards. I want to be clear with that. The financial grade API is really just a secure extension, if you will. We went from VGA to super VGA. We went from OAuth 2 to super OAuth 2 is really how I describe FAPI. So the comms protocol is important because the truck isn't worth anything if it's just sitting there. The truck has this wonderful container on it full of lovely stuff, and it's not worth anything until I can transport it somewhere interoperably, and I can just pull up and drive. And the neat thing about standards is not only is the truck got a common container on it, but it also has an automatic transmission because no one knows how to drive a standard anymore. And so the more I think plug and play we make things, the more people that can just jump in a truck, jump in a lorry and tool down the road and deliver your items. And so the more tools we offer as an ecosystem, I think the better off we are. So an ideal world is we all have a standardized container on the back. We all have a common truck platform height, common drive side, and they're all automatics so that you just plug it in and it works. No worries, no special training, no special tools. That's the ideal. Ralph?
Yeah, I could completely agree. The other thing that's really important with these standards, and we won't dive too much into the tech, is a common customs regime. So whenever that truck meets a border, the border officials know what's in the truck, who's driving the truck, is the truck authorized, is the truck licensed, and the truck is therefore free to pass unencumbered without us having to, fill out more and more forms to prove identity, prove authenticity, to prove, as we transfer borders. So these open finance ecosystems, and when you define standards, do, as you were saying, Don, do intersect all parts of the necessary specifications, standards, processes, procedures, governance, and accreditation frameworks necessary to drive down that cost for someone to get a truck and to move their goods, which they've newly manufactured, from point A to point B in the lowest possible cost at the fastest point of time in the most secure way, so that we can essentially bring new digital goods to market, to do so in a way that breaks down borders, so we can bring those goods to the widest possible digital markets that we possibly can. And like the real world, some of these standards are quite well, evolved. Everyone, truck engines are relatively standardized now, no matter where you go. But we haven't quite decided, are we driving on the left? Are we driving on the right? Are we all driving manuals? Are we all driving 5-speed, 6-speed, 8-speed, etc.? But some of the elements of these standards are being, globally, are starting to get there. Things like, as you said, the shipping container, or, the truck has wheels and we're going to use trucks as opposed to flying. But others also have a long way to go. So things like common accreditation frameworks, common customs arrangements, a lot of ecosystems, particularly those that are market-led as opposed to being regulatory-led, still have challenges with centralized accreditation and onboarding, which can be quite challenging for those truck drivers, because every time they drive up to a new bank, or they try and access a new bank services or bring those services to market, they've essentially got to jump through a whole heap of new customs paperwork again and again and again, even though they may have exactly the same standard truck, and their papers were just checked by another entity just down the road. So if we can sort of address all of these standards and break down those barriers wherever they exist by using common standards or common frameworks or common accreditation processes, not just the technical standards, then we'd really be on the way to open X.
At the risk of going a little off piece, do you want to talk a little bit about things around cross-border payments and OIDC federation, the kind of things that you're talking about as the common customs regime, which
Sure.
enables standards to interoperate. And again, I think trying to have standards that interoperate across the globe is always going to be a challenge, but having more regional cooperation, as you do with customs regimes, it's actually a great analogy that you pulled up. So movement of goods around EU, around movement of goods around the GCC, around the ASEAN countries, that's really a much more achievable thing, right? So in the same way, achieving regional interoperability of standards around certain things like payments, around KYC between countries where citizens and people move around quite a lot and often have financial relations in different countries. Prioritizing those kind of things really will kind of push the interoperability agenda, because there's a real use case out there. But sorry, yeah, going back to, if you want to talk a little bit about OIDC Federation and cross-border payments and where you're seeing interoperability help over there.
Sure. Let's start briefly with the lowest level of standards and standardization. Broadly around the world, everyone's finally starting to coalesce on a single set of standards in terms of how we talk. As we said, super OAuth. Everyone's sort of broadly agreed to build on the work that the OpenID Foundation Financial Grade API Working Group has done to at least agree that we're all going to talk in a particular way from a security point of view. And that's great, because that means we don't really need to be worrying about the security side of standards anymore. And in most ecosystems, that's really been the 50%. That's been 50% of the effort that has gone or needed to go into building these ecosystems, has been agreeing the base security principle. So just by standardizing that globally, a huge amount of effort has been taken away and taken out of launching these new data sharing ecosystems. I know some of the new data sharing ecosystems that are going live in the Middle East, we've been able to do this in weeks, what took years to really sort of nail out in the UK. And Latin America and Brazil sort of took those as a standing start and said, yeah, that's good enough for us. We'll also use that standard. So they were able to concentrate on the next sort of layers down. Some of the other standards that are still have some regional sort of differences would be things like consent. So there isn't really a consolidated consent standard globally. So consent in this context of the non-technical audience would be things like, how do we ask for something? So how do we ask for have access to make a payment? Do we ask for access to data? Different ecosystems perform this framework or perform this asking in different technical ways. But there are now some new standards that are emerging, but they're only now starting to be adopted by these ecosystems. So whilst there are new standards now that address this area of fragmentation, they're still relatively new. And finally, the other big one is really, how do we bring these ecosystems together? How do we build an ecosystem so that everyone has a standardized means of confirming who's who in the zoo? You know, from a fintech point of view, where are the banks? Where do I find them? How do I talk to them? How do I, know they're a real bank and they're accredited inside this ecosystem? And from the bank's point of view, how do I know that there's a real fintech and this fintech is authorized to engage in this ecosystem and I should trust them without making them fill out more customs paperwork or more bilateral onboarding processes? And that's a new standard from the OpenID Federation, or called OpenID Federation, which is also incubated by the OpenID Foundation, not to confuse those two Fs. And that is a new standard that basically the industry has been working on to try and allow federations to be created and stood up in a simple way. But what's really powerful about this standard is it allows different federations to join themselves together. So no longer do you need to have all of the banks in one region and all of the fintechs in another region agree to all establish connections to each other all bilaterally. Technically, the standards now exist to allow those federations to join each other and prove each other's or each of its participants' authenticity at the federation level. Now, this is great from a technology point of view, and whilst those standards are being rolled out now in some more modern ecosystems, I think Freddi, and to Don's point earlier, tackling the legislative and the compliance and the regulatory challenges of making those federations functionally operate together is a far bigger ask. Don, what do you think?
Well, again, the tech is not the hard part. If you think about, I'll go back to your customs analogy. You're getting the customs and the legal frameworks and the cultural frameworks to agree, because typically, law codifies what you have in cultural practices. And so getting all those different viewpoints, to interoperate is much, much trickier because you have a lot of peopleware involved that is much more difficult. Now, when you do have, we do that today. You look at common tax treaties, we look at common customs arrangements between different areas and regions. So it does happen. It's just happens, unfortunately, at a glacial pace for a variety of reasons. And so that is a difficult piece, but there is a demand for it. And I will tell you, I was talking to the Mexican Bankers Association just in January, and I gave a typical example where you have an American who owns a factory just across the border in northern Mexico and wanted a piece of milling equipment and wanted to go to a foundry in Mexico and said, hey, I need a $500,000 piece of equipment. They're expensive little buggers. And they don't know you from Adam. You normally would show up with some paper statements and they hope you were not good at Photoshop, and you were. But the idea that foundry could connect it to your American bank and you can do eKYC and look at history in real time for free, and then have a great sense of it, actually make it a legitimate lending decision, credit decision right there, was amazing. And they were stunned. You could do that? I said, yeah, the tech exists. It's not a problem. But it's the getting permission from one party to talk to another is the trick. And I will go back to another earlier thing on interoperability, just because I think it's important. We touched on it. This safety and security from having a common interoperable set of standards is huge to protect users of that space, especially newbies and people who are less technically inclined in that space. Save them from themselves. It used to be working on your car was a lot more dangerous, but now we have standardized engines and standardized color coding for everything. It's a lot harder. It's a lot safer for everyone. The engines are more reliable now. They don't do weird things. They don't need as much care and feeding anymore. So you're a lot less likely to get stranded on the side of the road with important payloads. So I think standardization also is a huge boon to safety, security, and privacy as well. I had to raise that. Have to.
It's a huge point. When you have your deliberations around things like the FTX working group that you're so closely in, or the various working groups that you're so closely involved with, how big a part do the conversations around interoperability with with countries like Canada, the USA, and Mexico kind of play in a very kind of regional sense. Do you find those conversations taking center stage quite often, or it's not something that's on the minds of people that are involved in these?
Well, right now, like I said, we're still helping members get stood up. We're getting away from credentials-based access and that sort of thing. I've got in North America alone, we have roughly 12,000 banks, credit unions, investment firms, brokers, payroll companies, not to mention the fintechs who are wanting, roughly 8 to 10,000 of those. So it's a huge ecosystem we're trying to move along and make a jump from 1990s technology to current. But interoperability is certainly on top of mind because we want to build this once. Now, a quarter of my members are Canadian. We have Canadian staff. We have Canadian board members. We're very, very much aware as you reach our largest trading partner. We've got to make sure that this works. And it works federally, provincially, at the state level. So culturally, it ties in well. So again, that container is very comfortably, oh, yes, it's labeled in English and French. I had to. So it was very important to make sure it worked in that standpoint. We have members on 4 continents, and we do have implementations in other jurisdictions outside of North America as well. And we built this to be global ready. And so neat thing is Open Finance, as you gentlemen know, is a small, small community. And we all look at each other's homework. Hey, what are you working on? What did they do? And I think that's wonderful. And I think that's helped lead to a lot of commonality. We all use REST. We all use JSON. We're all using OAuth 2 variants up to FAPI. And even the common data elements, we're borrowing heavily from ISO for dates and times and things like that, and currency amounts. So there's a lot of similarity there from the data and security standpoint. But to Ralph's point, the legal and cultural frameworks that allow that to interoperate is really the hardest part. And the extent that you see nations with common legal language and banking cultures, i.e. Commonwealth nations, I think you'll see, some of the first connectivity, the easiest connectivity, because so much is already the lingua franca is already there. From beyond, more or less, Ralph's smiling, but yeah, more or less. Beyond that, it will be a bit of a challenge just because the way things look differently. And that's okay. It's just you've got to respect those cultural uniquenesses that develop a different way.
I mean, certainly, there's a lot more of that standing on the shoulders of giants that we see in the standards world, in the open finance standards world today, right? Comparing the amount that we had to invent and build from scratch in the initial UK days to what we need to do now when we are involved in drafting some of the newer standards. There's so much more existing open standards that we can leverage and reuse that it naturally builds in a degree of interoperability that just wasn't there a few years ago. Ralph, how do you see this playing out with the OpenID Foundation and the FAPI working group and the other groups that you're involved with? They have a slightly more membership that's extracted a lot more globally as well. And do you see the same degree of importance that's given to the interoperability side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So the main reason that Latin America, or Brazil particularly, was a significant success was the conformance and certification programs that have been run there to really drive towards a single, consistent, and publicly demonstrable interoperable standard. So in the same way as you can go and look at Google Chrome and Firefox's results for their latest browser version runs against, say, the W3C's testing suite, in Brazil, anyone and any participant can view any other participant's security attestation of conformance and review all of their results. And that peer review process has stood that country in quite good stead. Now, the OpenID Foundation runs the conformance and certification program for security interop. Raidiam runs the program for functional interoperability, using the same conformance suite code base that the OpenID Foundation has developed and really makes available for anyone to be able to utilize and build a service that is compliant, secure, and safe. And that more and more vendors are releasing products that meet those secure those secure standards. And the goal really is to drive through to interoperability. Now, and that's done in several ways. The FAPI working group has created FAPI2, and FAPI2 really had it was the first security profile that we've seen published that has a formal attacker model. And basically, we started collectively as a group with, let's look at all the potential threats, and then let's go and design a security profile that was the simplest and the most secure and just met that requirement. So the FAPI working group really sort of narrowed its focus for FAPI2 in terms of targeting building an interoperable, highly secure, but also very simple, wherever possible, security profile that would meet a very defined attacker model. So I think the role of the OpenID Foundation, and particularly that working group, cannot be understated in terms of designing that specification and standard. Saying that specification really is targeting only one part of what is required to build an entire stack, as Don was saying. It's a stack of standards and a stack of policies that need to go into creating an ecosystem. And the FAPI security profile is one of the most important foundational technical layers. But on top of that, there are still other choices, and there are other standards like FDX that needs to sit on top that defines those functional payloads. But even for those standards, a very robust and very public and transparent conformance and certification program is required, because as you can imagine, it must be incredibly frustrating when two people that portend to speak the same language start a conversation and you realize you actually can't communicate. It sounds like you're talking the same words. It sounds like you're talking English. You can establish a phone call, no problem, and it's a secure phone call, but it's just as equally as frustrating and just as non-productive if you cannot, when you're talking, actually understand each other. So other standards bodies that do look at the functional space should be looking at what the OpenID Foundation does for the technical and security space and drawing inspiration from the good work that they've done to fill the other gaps.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about horizon scanning. What do you see coming up next in the interoperability space? And if a regulator was asking you for advice on what you would focus on in terms of interoperability and open finance standards, what would your advice be?
Well, I mean, I'm a bit biased in that I believe the free market is the best developer. The consumer, their demand is the best driver of what data should we have in this huge open finance library. We talk about open banking, open finance, and open data. The customer used to vote with their feet, now they vote with their thumbs. What is the demand? And for example, we've got a payroll endpoint for verification of income and employment and pay stubs, not because anybody else in the world's got one, but because our customers demanded it. They wanted to go get a mortgage in 5 minutes. You're talking about buying a home or selling a home. You need verification of income. And so there are things out there that the free market does very well. To technical standards, I think it's best left to the engineers who have the direct customer relationships. But with respect to trust frameworks and being able to vet third parties in the space, accreditation, I think we have a long way to go in North America. To be fair, everything is bespoke and custom, and that's kind of the polar opposite of interoperability. You can't, to your point, Ralph, pull up and redo customs forms every time you go to a new shop that truck's making delivery. Redo your customs forms every single time. It's like, can I have just one customs form? Show it, great. You have it audited, have a digital certificate tied to it. So I think that's an area of growth and scalability that we need in North America. It help everybody out and understand who's pulling up to my shop. Do I know them? Do I trust the truck?
Ralph, what do you want for Christmas?
Well, what I'd like for Christmas, completely for Christmas, if I had a total wish list, is I sort of echo Don's point. I don't think we're going to get to complete everybody designs a chair in exactly the same way that goes onto those shipping containers, and nor do I think it's necessarily appropriate. Some countries that may require 5 legs, and others may, other regions may all coalesce more easily around a chair requiring 4 legs. If I was going to go vote for Christmas, I'd really like the next ecosystems to really be on FAPI2, broadly see the existing ecosystems agree that would be the North Star in terms of that's what they want to aim for, and then we'll work, a commitment to sort of working towards it. And I'd really like to start seeing more ecosystems or more regulators that were concerned about the creation of data sharing ecosystems, recognize that because of all of the foundational work that has gone into laying these standards and that there are interoperable standards, realize that they can start considering the creation of their own data sharing ecosystem to enable these markets, either by policy, by simply allowing these markets to come to fruition under market-led forces, or if required with a little bit of regulatory push to give them the sort of go-ahead. I think I don't think collectively as an industry we do a good enough job of articulating just how far we have come from an interoperability point of view to other potential stakeholders who are still potentially looking at just how much cost, effort, and expense went into the creation of the UK, and have been put off by that as the potential, as their only sort of guide as to, oh no, this is really challenging, and oh no, this is really, really quite difficult, or oh no, it requires a lot of uber, bespoke work to be done. That would be my Christmas wish list for.
And we now live in a world where we can sit back and say it's been done before. We just need to do it better, and we need to push the boundaries of what can be achieved.
Yeah, I will call
it's
out.
a much better world to be in. Sorry, Tom.
Yeah, no. Again, the UK had the courage of the first draft, and they got a tremendous amount right out of the box. And to your point, Ralph, the successor nations that now stand at their own regime have all those learnings. So we're doing it at a fraction of the cost. I think UK making it 110 employees at one time. We have 10 in North America. We spend roughly $3.5–4 million a year, and we have 76 million consumers on FDX. But we could only have done that because the UK paved those roads for us. So we had all the learnings of that. If we had to do it bespoke from scratch and literally a blank sheet of paper, I think it would have cost a lot more. As we said, what do you want to do?
Yeah,
and I think that's the key point is that's the big message that we certainly give to regulators when we're talking around the world. You no longer really have to be talking about how to build these roads. The best gift, as you said, Don, was that the UK, like the Romans, gave people the instructions on how to build roads. Now the question really is, what do you want to put on them? And that means that you can be spending most of your money now on, okay, what are we going to do? Is it healthcare? Is it telco? Is it energy? Is it finance? Is it what is it? Where do we want to go? Because we have the blueprints, courtesy of the UK, and the iterations from other markets, including the US, Latin America, and Australia, that are built on them and freely publish those enhancements available. So yeah, increasingly, just people can concentrate now on what do you want your data sharing to do, the use cases, and what is the market asking for, as opposed to how do we technically do it.
That's another nice point, because the data standards are all freely published around to everyone. So you should never have to, if you're a jurisdiction looking to stand things up, you shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. You say, I like what you did. Nah, I want so-and-so's investments one. I want your pensions one. I want your banking one. I want it. Fine. Go for it.
We've got the payloads, and we know how to transfer them around. It's just stitching those together into something cohesive. That's where the game is these days. Excellent, gentlemen. Any parting thoughts before we close off?
Testing, and interoperability testing. You can, doesn't matter what your standards are, doesn't matter how well you think you've written them, everybody, when they read those standards, will always go and interpret them differently. Now, I use a brief analogy I've given before. When we were implementing in the UK, we had the CMA 9, but some of those 9s had several different, some of those banks had several brands that had to implement those standards. And I'll use some of them had divisions in the UK, some of them had divisions in Switzerland. Even within a single banking brand, that standard resulted in 2 very different implementations. So without tests and without a very firm commitment to test suite development, you'll never get interoperability. And without interoperability, you will never really realize that the potential of a low cost for new entrants, highly competitive, consumer-driven OpenX being brought to fruition. That's my closing point.
I think on interoperability, to extend upon what Ralph said, don't fear interoperability. The idea being that testing is important to not only reassure yourselves and your internal teams that you built it right, but to, as a post-release testing, hey, did I break anything? Every Sunday when I do my code push, you can run your test suite internally just for fun and see, did you break anything? No, I did. Great. And it's one more thing. So don't fear that interoperability testing. It is a useful tool, both from a compliance thing, but also from a daily operational thing. And finally, I would call out to the ecosystem, get involved. Look at the different standards around the world for data, for security, for auth regimes and risk assessments. Get involved in this space, look around, and don't be afraid to sample different things. Everyone's so, oh, we're bespoke. We have to build our own. Why? So many people have blood, sweat, and tears to build things. It's all available, free licenses, MIT licenses, and that sort of thing. By all means, please use that, because that's how we're going to get to a common set of protocol stack. We're eventually going to get to organically, market forces are going to drive us to a common protocol stack eventually. And then we're going to wonder, gosh, why did we wander in the wilderness for so many years? And no one will remember, oh, all the things that led before. You just plug it in, it works globally. I mean, and that's where we're going to get there. The question is, how long will it take us?
It's certainly a world I'd like to see before I end my career and hang up my hat. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful talking with you. Always a pleasure. Thanks for your time once again, and hope to see you around soon.
Thanks, Freddi. See you later.
Thanks, guys.